Okay, so I'm very excited to welcome Mr. Josh Peck to Exploring Faith. He's our very first guest on the show. He's an author of many books as well as a director of many films surrounding just religion, end times, eschatology. Josh, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you on. I have a bunch of questions for you in reference to the book, but we're going to be talking specifically about your latest book, Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I have right here. Very excited to discuss this. It looks like it's a continuation of The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, another book which you have written, which we can also kind of touch base on very, very quickly. But Josh, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be talking with you today.
Great. So before we get started, you want to just kind of give a quick background on yourself, just kind of how you got involved in this whole realm of eschatology, prophecy. You've been directing, writing books, directing films for quite some time now. You have a ton of experience in this area. What led you to this? How long you've been doing it? Before we kind of get into the book itself.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in a Christian household, so I've always had an interest in prophecy. And the church that I went to didn't deal with it a whole lot, but they were open to it at least. But for me, that was like my focus. Like I would read Revelation more than I would read any other book in the Bible. I was just fascinated with it. And so that carried on into my adulthood. And about 10 years ago, I got into full-time ministry. I started off just self-publishing my own books and kind of doing my own thing, learning the ropes. I started a podcast to try to not only, well, first and foremost, to help people who might be listening, but as you well know, when you first start a new podcast and you're first developing your audience, it takes a while. So I also used that to have on guests that I thought were, doing a lot of good work in the realm of prophecy ministry. And I wanted to network with those people. So through that podcast, which I still host today, it's called The Sharpening Report. But through that podcast, I was able to meet a lot of the people that I now work with on a daily basis. So that's kind of how I got into it. It's obviously a much longer story than that,
Sure,
but
sure.
that's just kind of the highlights. And so after doing full-time ministry for probably a couple of years, I was invited to be one of Skywatch TV's very first interviews.
Hmm.
They were just launching, and it was me, Sharon Gilbert, and Michael Lake were like the first three uh, guests that they had. And apparently, it was Michael Lake that actually got me in touch with Tom Horn in the first place. So through that, I got to meet everybody there. We all hit it off really well. And shortly after that, Tom Horn emailed my wife and I and offered us jobs there at Skywatch. So we moved from Michigan to Missouri to accept jobs there. I
Right
was
on.
there for 7 years. Yeah, I was there for 7 years. And I kind of look at that time as like boot camp. That was where I really learned how how full-time ministry works and what it's like in a big studio and what it's like for other authors and it's really interesting because I also noticed that there's this perception from the audience uh, because I get asked a lot of questions about sometimes people I haven't met yet. But I think there's this idea that we kind of all know each other all the time and we're always keeping in contact with each other. And that's just not, it's just like how you are with your friends, how anybody is with
Sure.
their friends. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes a year will go by and I don't know, like Tim Alberino, like he's about my age. We're really close. I consider him one of my closest friends, but sometimes a year will go by and we just, we get busy with other things and we just don't keep in contact. But then when we do, it's like we just talked yesterday. So it's a lot of that. So that was kind of when I noticed just how many guests come in to film shows, and then how it's really common that you may not hear from them for another year or so because there's just so many. So that was really cool. That was kind of eye-opening. And then so after that, I worked very briefly with my very good friend Zach Drew at IGBY Ministries. I worked there for about 9 months and helped him get helped him with his ministry. And then I came here to Prophecy Watchers. They offered me a job, and I've already known, through Skywatch, I've already known everybody at Prophecy Watchers for a long time anyway. So it seemed like a perfect fit, and it was a really good move for me and the family, especially having 5 kids and everything. So when I went to IGBY, we moved from Missouri to Illinois, and then 9 months later from Illinois now to Oklahoma. And I hope I'm done moving. I hope this is
Yeah.
it. So we've been at I've been at Prophecy Watchers for about 6 months now, which has just gone by like that. It's gone by so fast. I absolutely love the ministry, love everybody there. It is a perfect fit. And I'm doing the same stuff that I've always done. So I'm writing books and I'm making movies and I'm helping them with some of their commercials and doing some TikTok videos for their social media and stuff. So it's all a lot of creative stuff that works really well with what I feel the gifts that God has given me and what my calling is. So that's just kind of and so that leads us to today. That's a brief rundown of my kind of my history and ministry.
That's awesome. I'm wondering if the Lord blessed you and Tim with the same fertility clinic, if you will, because I believe he has 5 kids also.
I
But
know, and
yeah,
all of his are boys. He's got 5 boys.
oh
I don't know
man.
how the guy has any hair left. Like mine would be either
Well, I already
gone
lost
or
mine.
white.
I already lost mine, and I only have one son. So yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
got 2 boys, and oh man, they could be a handful.
and yeah, moving too. I totally hear you on that. We relocated from Arizona to Texas a couple years ago, and we've been blessed ever since. We've always been blessed, but yeah, it is stressful when you have the family and all the stuff that you're moving with, But I totally hear you there. And just
Yeah,
I didn't mention this before. Yeah, absolutely. Prophecy Watchers. I'm going to include some links down below in the description for all my audience that maybe aren't familiar with these YouTube channels. But Prophecy Watchers, absolutely phenomenal content that you guys have been putting out. And you are a part of that as well as Daily Renegade as well. And I'm sorry, the name of your podcast also, if you wanted to
yeah.
mention again.
It's Sharpening Report, and that's at dailyrenegade.com. So yeah, Daily
Okay,
Renegade is kind of like the sharpening. Well, when I first started the podcast, it was just called the Sharpening, and then it transformed into the Sharpening Report years later. But I had to start Daily Renegade because YouTube was deleting all of our videos.
sure.
If I even met for a time, if I even mentioned Israel, like they would just delete that video. So Daily Renegade is a website, just dailyrenegade.com, where people can go and watch my full videos, full episodes of Sharpening Report, full update videos, stuff that I can't put on YouTube because of censorship. And there's also a great community there. Basically, the website works like there's a watch page, which works exactly like YouTube without the censorship. And then there's a community page, which works just like Facebook, but without the censorship.
Right
So
on.
that's dailyrenegade.com. And then, yeah, if anybody wants any books of mine, the best place to get it is prophecywatchers.com because, yeah, they're on Amazon, but why support Jeff Bezos when you can support a really awesome prophecy ministry that's doing really, really, really good work in the world and is being that light that the world desperately needs. So, yeah, prophecywatchers.com. If you're going to get any of my books, get them there.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue to talk about the book that you just wrote, which I
Yeah.
have right here. So, Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, let's get into it. So, why? I guess, how about this? Okay, so I'm a relatively new believer. I was baptized a few years ago. So, it's one of those things where it's like once you start to dig into Bible, just studying the Bible in general, and then you start to learn more about prophecy, and you learn about all these other books, the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all this stuff, and you're still trying to understand the Book of Revelation, let alone all these other areas of information where like it just really starts to open up your mind to like, oh my Lord, like all these other things are going on. So I guess if you would like to get into just kind of what prompted you to write a book about this, what is the significance or relevance of the Dead Sea Scrolls? What are they? Just for let's just take it from the standpoint of a relatively
Sure.
new Christian or new believer.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great place to start because when I first heard of these extra biblical books, and I'd been raised in the church, but there was a big period of my life where I didn't deny Jesus, but I definitely fell away from the church. And
Yeah,
I wasn't really living for God. I was living for myself. And there are times that I wonder if I had died at that point, would I have gone to heaven or hell? And I really don't know because I can tell you the time that I know that I got saved for real. When you're brought up into it, I remember being really really young and my mom coming in my room and going through the salvation's prayer with me, but I was so young I didn't really know what was going on or what it was. Um, and it's not a collection of words that saves you anyway. It's actual faith. So it was coming out of that time where I was kind of falling away from the church. It was coming out of that where my faith was really ignited. So at that time, in a lot of ways, I was still I felt like a new Christian as well, and even though I wasn't, but I felt like I was. In that time, I started to hear about these extra biblical texts, and I was really weary of them at first. I
Right.
had part of why I had fallen out of church is because I got into New Age, and the upbringing that I had didn't really like equip me for that. So there was a lot of new age stuff that I didn't even know was really new age. And it was just, it was a mess. That's a long story, but, um, so coming out of that, I was really extra sensitive to anything that was just like not the Bible because I was so scared that I would accidentally get back into New Age again or something like or something else. So for a long time, I really struggled with like the Book of Enoch,
Yeah.
and I prayed about it and I studied and you know I started seeing how there are quotes from Enoch in the Bible. Now that doesn't validate the entire book of Enoch, but it at least validates those quotes. So it's like there's at least something in the book of Enoch worth reading, and we get that in the Bible. And I will say too, one of one of the things that I'm emphatic about is you don't need the Dead Sea Scrolls to be a Christian. Like you don't need the Dead Sea Scrolls at all. If you're wary about it at all and you want to give it time or just don't want to deal with it, that's perfectly fine. As long as you stick with your Bible, you're good. The Dead Sea Scrolls, what I found out, they don't change anything in the Bible. They don't alter anything. They go right in line. Well, a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls are biblical books. Like all of the books of the Old Testament were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll get into the history and explain what those are in just a moment. But they don't change anything, but they do add a lot of context and a lot of
Right.
history that helps us understand some of our Bible. Like one of the biggest examples of this is what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You get to the end of the Old Testament and everything in Israel seems to make sense, but then you start in Matthew, everything in Israel is different. There's Pharisees now, there's Sadducees. I mean, everything's different.
Mhm.
Well, there's a 400-year period there where some of the documents found in the Dead Sea Scrolls helps add some context to tell us what happened and give us that history. So it is really helpful. Um, so basically, what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, they are scrolls that were not included in the canon of Scripture that ancient Jew, not all of them, but that ancient Jews believed in. For a while, they all did, but then there was a split in and this was during that intertestamental period, during
Okay.
the period between the Old and New Testament. And this is where you had factions start to break off. So you had Pharisees, Sadducees, but you also had Essenes. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are the like the writings of the Essenes, basically. Um, and when you read through them, they believed that they were holding on to the authentic ancient Jewish tradition of their belief. They believed that, okay, the Pharisees started to believe in this thing called oral Torah,
Okay.
meaning interpretations of the Bible passed down orally by speech. Generation to generation. So, a Pharisee would say, okay, yeah, the Torah says this, but so and so interprets it as this, and then they would go with that. Well, the Essenes totally rejected that. They said no, we're not. You go by the text, and if you need any kind of interpretation, we have some writings, but ultimately you go by what the text says. So they rejected oral Torah. That was part of the breakup. So the Essenes lived in a place in Israel called Qumran. Um, uh, and I mean, there were Essenes all throughout Israel, but the main, like the priesthood, the main Essene priests, they would be called the Zadokian priests.
Okay.
And there were a lot of different reasons for this split between the Essenes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. That's just one of them. Another one was the calendar. The Pharisees and Sadducees wanted to adopt a pagan calendar to kind of get them out of a bind, because it was probably Antiochus Epiphanes that did this, but there's arguments for other individuals, but it was probably him. But when he came in and desecrated the temple and did all that, he basically said, okay, we will let you do some of your Jewish things, but you have to adopt our lunar calendar, because before that Israel had a solar calendar.
Right.
And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were like, okay, sure, we'll do that. But the Essenes were like, no, that's no, we absolutely cannot do that because we have festival days. We have certain practices that need to be done on certain days in certain ways because if they're not, the priests die. And even in the Pharisees' own records, you can go back um, and you can find that from from the before this, from the time that they kept records, there were only like 30 priests or something that ever died. But after that, in a really short amount of time, there was like 300. And it's because of this switch to the lunar calendar. So a lot of people have this idea that Israel always had a lunar calendar. That's not exactly right. They used to have a solar one, but they switched in the intertestamental period. And then some people might say, "But Josh, in the Torah, and it says new moon all the time." Well, it was translated new moon in English. It really means new month or the first of the month. That's what it when you look back to the original language. So again, it doesn't change anything, but it gives us some extra context of
Sure.
what happened. Uh, so the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, they're so after a while, the Essenes fled the area, and there's actually a really cool story of why that was, but I can get into that in a little bit. But they fled the area and they left behind in jars and stuff. They left behind copies of their scrolls.
Okay.
Well, because of the temperature and the dryness of that area, they were preserved really, really well for thousands of years.
What a
So a couple thousand,
coincidence.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So
Yeah.
a couple thousand years later, they were rediscovered. Um, and this was right when Israel was becoming a nation again. I mean, the timing in this is just impeccable. It's like within a year or a few months away from each other. So it's just what are the chances of that?
Wow. Yeah.
They got rediscovered, and but even then, it took a long time for people to translate it and start making it available to the rest of us. We had to wait till I think like the 90s or something before anything started to get out. And then stuff started to get out more and more and more. But of course, when you have something like that, you're going to have multiple translators that translate things differently. And it's kind of like, well, like even our Bibles today, we have the King James version, we have the
Sure.
ESV, we have all these different translations. And it's like, which one is right? It's like, well, you really the original language is the one that's right, but many of us don't speak Hebrew or Greek, so you got to just do the best you can with what you have. Same with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So for me, when I look at them, I have a few different translations, and then I try to because I can't read the original languages either. So I just try to piece together the best I can, and then I know some Hebrew scholars and stuff that I can ask if I have questions. So those got rediscovered, and they're all available now. What's amazing though is in the extra biblical scrolls. So this would be things like Enoch, Jubilees, things like that were actually found there. There's some prophetic claims. There's
Yeah.
some prophetic things made, and so far, everything that they've prophesied has come true. And so it makes me wonder, was there a reason that these were discovered at that time? Because I'm big into end time prophecy, and I believe that we are, if we're not in the end times now, we're certainly close.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I say end times, I don't mean tribulation. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. I personally, I'm a pre-trib rapture believer, and
Hmm.
7 year tribulation. I believe all that's in the future. I know not everybody agrees. Totally cool with me. I'm not the kind of guy that's going to fight about it, but that is where I'm coming from on it. And what I've found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is it at least supports it if it doesn't outright just teach that view itself. It at least supports it. So anyway, so when when I started to see that some of the stuff that they prophesied had come true, and a lot of it was about Jesus' first coming. And I started thinking about it. It's like, okay, this makes sense why there were times in the Gospels where Jesus would sometimes talk to a huge group of people, like hundreds of people, and he barely says 2 words and they all immediately get saved.
Right.
But then there are other times he'll talk to 1 or 2 people and he'll show them miracles and heal people and do everything, and they just will not accept it. Well, it's because the Essenes actually had their own prophecies. Pharisees had a completely different view of what the Messiah was going to be, like what he was going to do, what his role was going to be. And the Essenes, though, they had their own prophecies and they knew what to look for. And there are prophecies about Jesus that are specific to the extra biblical Dead Sea Scrolls that aren't found in the Bible at all. So when they saw him do those things that they have in their own texts, they believed. They
They
immediately
immediately
believed
knew.
because yeah, because they had
Yeah.
been reading these things their entire lives, so they knew exactly what to look for. But that's why the Pharisees struggled so much because they're now like the Pharisees were aware of Essene theology, and the Essenes were aware of Pharisee theology, just like we Protestants were aware of Catholic theology, even though we don't believe it. Catholics are aware of our theology, even though they don't believe it. So, I mean, it would be like if Jesus came today. Well, if he started uh, and this is complete hypothetical because this is not how prophecy works in our Bibles. But
Yeah.
let's say Jesus didn't come 2,000 years ago and he decided to do it now. And let's say we as Protestants have all these prophecies that we've been told what to look for. And let's say the Catholics think that they have those too. Well, when Jesus comes, if he starts doing a bunch of Catholic things, well, then I'm going to be a Catholic. If he comes and then starts doing a bunch of Protestant things and fulfilling those prophecies, then I'm going to be a Protestant. So it was like that, except the Pharisees, by and large, were a lot more stubborn with it, and
Right.
the Essenes were too, but they knew they were right. So I guess we can kind of give them a pass on that. Um, so just the whole Catholic Protestant thing is just an example of kind of how it was then. They were aware of each other's theology, they just didn't believe in it. So when the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were like in power, when the Pharisees saw all of these prophecies being fulfilled, they had to maintain power. They had to reinterpret it. They even had to go as far as to say that he was possessed by the devil, by a demon, just so they could hold on. Because if they were to admit, it would be like the Vatican admitting that the Protestants were right the whole time. I mean,
Sure.
it's just not going to happen. No matter
Yeah.
what, Jesus could come down from the heavens. It's just not going to happen. And so that's exactly what they were going through then. Um, so once I saw that and saw that all of these prophecies about Jesus' first coming were all fulfilled, I mean, they had it down to the day. They knew that he was going to be cut off for the transgressions of people. Like, so they like knew the whole deal. Now there's parts that were hidden, so it doesn't violate where in oh, I forget which book I wrote. I have a whole chapter dedicated to it though, but where it says that certain things were hidden. If Satan knew that killing Jesus was going to do all this, he never would have put him on the cross. So the Essenes didn't have all of it, but they had a lot more than the Pharisees did.
Mhm.
Um, so once I saw that, it was like, okay, well, what about other prophecies? Because they have prophecies related to our time as well, to a future time. And what about our prophecies? And I started reading those, and it's like these line up really, really well with Revelation and Daniel and the prophecies in the Bible. Like these line up like immensely well. And then digging more into it, even some of the writing style is the same. And so looking into all this, it's like, wow, John the Revelator was probably in a scene. John the Baptist certainly was.
Mhm.
And there's a couple others. Paul, it seems like when he converted to from Pharisee to Essene specifically. The Essenes at the time called themselves the Way. That
Okay.
that's what they called themselves. So when we read in Acts where Paul's like, there's this sect that, or there's these people that I follow the way. These people that you call a sect, they're talking about the Essenes. That's what Acts is talking about.
Okay.
And so it doesn't change anything, but it adds a lot of context because before I knew about this Dead Sea Scroll stuff, I had no idea what that passage in Acts meant. I had no idea what the way or this sect or like I had no idea, but now it makes absolute perfect sense. So when he converted, he likely converted to the Essene way and went through their whole process. And I go into that a lot in the book, and a lot more, but that's basically for me as in a way a sort of new Christian at the time coming into this. And by the way, it took me years to really get to the point where I wanted to write about this, like years and years and years. It was actually a good friend of mine, Dr. Ken Johnson, that really got me kind of hooked on this stuff. And I learned a lot of what I know. I learned from him, but then I've taken it into some other areas as well. So he and I have done a lot of shows together where where we pretty much, I think we agree on everything, but he goes into areas that I don't go into and study, and then I go into areas that he doesn't in study. And so it's I've learned a lot from him, and I hope he's learned a lot from me too. I think he has. But so that's been really interesting. But yeah, it took me a while. So the main thrust of all this is, if you as a Christian, if you're interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like absolutely look into them, but don't ever make the mistake at putting them on the same level as canon. They're not canon. They were
Sure.
kept out of the Bible for a reason. I actually open the book with that idea and talk about how we got our Bibles, why the books that we have are in there. There's conspiracy theories online that it was some massive conspiracy in like 300 AD, and none of I debunk all of that. All that's garbage. None of that's real. The Bibles that we have is the Bible that God wants us to have. Otherwise, it would be different. That doesn't mean that there's nothing else out there that has truth in it. Like my owner's manual to my microwave isn't in the Bible, but it's truthful. If my
Right.
microwave breaks down, I'm going to trust that manual to tell me
Yeah.
what to do. Um, so there's lots of things that are truthful, but may not be for everybody. Like if somebody doesn't have a microwave, then they don't need the
Right.
owner's manual to a microwave. So there are Christians that are just absolutely not interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't want to mess with it. They don't want to chance it. They don't have time to even validate everything. That's perfectly fine, and I make that really clear in the book. It's not for everybody, and you're not in sin if you don't read these things. Like it's totally fine. Just stick with your Bible. That's the most important thing. But if you're a Christian who does have an interest in it, you're not wrong by looking into it. You're not in sin by reading it. I was raised in a church that, like, to even read the Book of Enoch, like, you're in sin. And
Yeah.
I don't believe that. I can see a danger if somebody wants to take Enoch and then put it at the same level as biblical books and say this should have been in the Bible. This is inspired by God. People are trying to hide it from us. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. Especially with how widespread Enoch is. It's really easy to find. You can get it for free online. If they were trying to hide Enoch, they did a really bad job. And who's they anyway?
Right.
Because I go back and show, like, a lot of people want to say the Council of Nicaea or all these councils. They didn't have anything to do with what books get in and what don't, what doesn't. And one of them did, but that was so late. We already had what we had, and that was more of a reaction to a heresy. And actually, most, if not all, of these councils were a reaction to some heresy that was floating around at the time. So I would say absolutely look into it, but also know that you got to get an accurate translation. And even things with the Book of Enoch, I mean, there's like Second Enoch, Third Enoch. There are things that are not valid at all.
Mhm.
There are certain books that throughout time people have added things. And so when you look at one of them, you really got to be able to look at the history of it. So it does take work. And for a lot of people, they're like, well, I either want that done for me, which, if that's you, great, because I did it for you. They're in my books. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, this is what I do for a living. Like, this is my 9 to 5. If I had another 9 to 5 job, I wouldn't be able to do this. So I
Mhm.
totally understand that. It's a big part of what my ministry is around. So yeah, absolutely. Like, read my books, or Ken Johnson's books, or Dr. Michael Heiser talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sometimes read his books. Read people's books. Um, and if you're interested in it, and just don't have the time to validate everything, and then just be careful with it. But as long as you just always just have it reserved in your mind, I'm not going to lift this to the level of scripture in the Bible, but I'm going to take it seriously. I think that's a really good place to be in. So, a bit of a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of history to go through there with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So hopefully that gives kind of like a crash course on just the basics of the history, and then some of the interesting things that can be found in there.